Sudanese-born Zeinab Badawi is an author, broadcaster, and the president of the School of Oriental and African Studies at London University. Zeinab, you've written an African history of Africa, and the ambition of the work is clear from your subtitle, From the Dawn of Civilization to Independence. It's taking you to over 30 African countries. You've spent 7 years on this book. And some of the countries are places like Eritrea and Mauritania, Timbuktu even. And you've been on camels and donkey carts and so on. First of all, what a hugely ambitious work. And secondly, you, through the title, make it clear that an African history of Africa is going to be different than the normal histories of Africa that are Eurocentric and essentially written by white people. So tell us more about that.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Yes, the book is called, in fact, From the Dawn of Humanity to Independence in its published form. And the reason I wanted to call the book An African History of Africa is I wanted to basically address a vacuum, which is we have had many excellent accounts of Africa's history written by the Africanists, the Western historians, and I count many of them amongst my friends. And this is not about supplanting their good work. This is about supplementing it and bringing to the table African scholars, historians, archaeologists, paleontologists, you name it, who I felt had been denied a voice on the international public stage. So the fact that I've worked in the international media through the BBC for so many decades meant that I did have that public stage. And therefore, I felt that I had to really be a kind of intercessor between them and a global audience. And that is why I wanted to write that book, because I believe that if you have people from the region telling their own history, it has an air of authenticity about it. And they also bring a slightly different perspective and just feel to the whole history. And they also use sources which have been overlooked by the Western historians. For example, they draw on Africa's rich oral tradition. There is a tendency to think that Africans didn't always write and therefore they have no history. But just because Africans didn't always write doesn't mean they didn't record their history. You just have to get at it in a different way, which is what these historians do. And they also look at sources, Arabic, Persian, and so on. So that is why I felt I wanted to embark on this project.
And you start, of course, with the origin of humanity. You've actually met Lucy, who many consider to be the first human, who was, of course, African. She originated in Africa. Tell us a bit about that side of things, about the way in which humanity started in Africa and the way that it expanded throughout the rest of the globe.
Sure. I mean, I start off by saying everybody is from Africa, therefore this book is for everyone, because the science...
Great marketing slogan, by the way. Fantastic. As soon as I saw that, I thought, well done, you. Your publicity people must be thrilled with you, by the way.
Well, I mean, even, you know, flaxen-haired, blue-eyed, pale complexion humans today all originated in Africa. That debate is settled. The science is settled. There may still be a debate about which part of Africa we originated from, but there's no question that there's nobody on Earth today who can't say that Africa is their mother continent. And yes, I did see Lucy. Lucy is an important part of our story. She's not from the line that we directly descended from, but she's an important part of our lineage. And I call her Dinkanesh, which is her name in the local Ethiopian language, the Amharic language, which means you are marvelous. And indeed, it was marvelous to see her bones. And what is remarkable about Lucy is that, you know, about 40% of her skeleton was found intact. And she gives us really good insights into our humanity. She would have used her hands. She was not habitually bipedal, but she did use her hands to make tools and to kill small animals like termites and so on. She would have lived in a tree. So ironically, we believe she died falling from a tree. So peril lay in her refuge. And we all began in Africa. Charles Darwin was the first person who made that observation, the great Victorian scientist, biologist. He said, since we are so like the African gorilla and chimpanzee, I mean, our DNA varies really by a few percentage points from them, and since these only existed in Africa, therefore we came from Africa. And you know, Andrew, there has been a bit of reticence over the centuries, and even today by the creationists, who just feel that, no, we couldn't have come from Africa. And even until the early part of this century, the Chinese paleontologists were really determined to try to show that they, at least, descended, if not all of humankind, from Peking man. But even they have now accepted that the human story begins probably in Eastern Africa. And my knowledge and inspiration draws from my very good late friend, Richard Leakey, the great Kenyan paleontologist. And, you know, it's like a big jigsaw puzzle, maybe 600 pieces. We've only got about 24. But I was very much a kind of pupil of Richard Leakey's, and I use his interpretation. So he says things, for example, like up until between 8 to 12,000 years ago, everybody was dark-skinned. And we began in our modern form, Homo sapiens sapiens, about 100,000 years ago. By about 90,000 years ago, we had populated the whole continent of Africa, about 1 million strong at that time, living in communities about 150. Between 60 to 90,000 years ago, a few of those early pioneers migrated out of the continent, went first to Arabia and then Europe and Asia. And that's how, and then they met other hominins like the Denisovans, like the Neanderthals, and they bred them into extinction, which is why still Eurasians have residual DNA, you know, markers from Neanderthals or Denisovans and the rest of it. But that's pretty much, in a nutshell, the origins of humankind.
And you mentioned DNA. Your own DNA is African, Arab, and of Muslim heritage, and it prompts me to ask: to what extent is race a sort of modern artificial phenomenon? Because it seems, from what you just said, and also from your statement in the book, that Africa is more racially and ethnically diverse than any other continent, and it's impossible and needless to reduce Africanness to race. To what extent is it worthwhile reducing anything to race?
I agree with you. I really, really do, Andrew. I think that it's, you know, nonsensical to think that there is a kind of identikit African, and that somebody who qualifies as a true African has to look a certain way. Like everywhere else in the world, continents neighbor other continents. There are coastal people. You know, North Africa has a Mediterranean coast. Africa has an Atlantic coast. Africa has a Red Sea coast. So inevitably people on the Red Sea are going to be mixing with people from across the seas, from Arabia. North Africa is going to be exposed to Western Asia, Southern Europe. So through the millennia, people everywhere have been mixing. So, you know, this idea that an authentic African can only look a certain way, I think really is a bit of a sterile debate. You know, it's a very reductionist one. And I use that observation, talking in particular about ancient Egypt, because I've developed a bit of a party trick now. I say to people, name me an African king or queen, and they almost invariably say Tutankhamun. And then they almost invariably say, but were the ancient Egyptians real Africans? And I think that's very telling that people still say that today. There's still a debate even in Egypt itself. You know, we've seen recent controversies. And that's because the Arabs conquered Egypt. And so a lot of people in Egypt subscribe to the Arab ideology. And so I think that for me, we need to redefine our definition of what an African is, and it shouldn't be ascribed to people of a certain race.
It's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, that African history is pretty much ancient Egyptian history is pretty much the only part of African history that's taught in the schools, or at least was when I was growing up. To what extent is that I want to ask you about essentially the role of the West in deciding what's important to study in Africa, because Napoleon, of course, created the modern Egyptomania, which you see more of in 1922 at the time of the Tutankhamun excavations. How much is the West responsible for what we find interesting in Africa still today?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's still today. I think that, using the long lens of history, people will say to me, oh, Westerners have a very set view of what Africa is like, and they have, on the whole, fairly negative stereotypes, the coups, the wars, the famines, and that kind of thing. And I always think that you can't jump on the train as it's, been embarked on this long journey. You've got to reach right far back into history to see that actually it's the continuation of a pattern that Africa has been globally seen through the eyes of its Western conquerors. The conquests which were carried out by the European imperial powers. They had their chroniclers, their writers, their missionaries, their explorers, their colonial officers, who would write through their perspective. And I think that has informed a great deal of the debate. I mentioned in my book how the terms animism and ancestor worship were coined in the 19th century by two British writers, and those are theories which have persisted, although you will find that African academics reject the term animism and say in no way does this actually define traditional African beliefs. Same with ancestor worship. They venerate their ancestors. They call on them to intercede on their behalf for their families on earth, but they don't actually worship their ancestors. So, these kinds of theories and ways of seeing Africa, I think, have influenced the way we see Africa today. The missionaries who went on their civilizing mission to Christianize these, backward people. There is a tendency to see Africans today still as kind of underdeveloped Europeans. And the infantilization of African people, I think, is quite unique compared to other people. I mean, I think people understand that Asia, China, India, whatever, these are countries that may not know very much about them, but they'll know that they had a magnificent past and wonderful art and so on. But Africa, I think, is uniquely infantilized. Its people are, and it's often seen its history denigrated, or they've been told they don't have any history, or it's been written by outsiders.
Actually, as a member of the House of Lords, I come across ancestor worship pretty much every week. Can we talk about the kingdom of Kush? Is it Kush? Kush?
Yeah, yeah.
Kush, in northern Sudan. It lasted 3,000 years, and I have to admit I'd never heard of it. And this is a terrible, terrible admission, especially from somebody who claims to be an historian.
Yeah.
But what it proves, I think, is a little bit of what you were saying earlier, that we jump really from ancient history, sort of hundreds of years forward. But this is your family comes from the Kush region of Sudan, and it's clearly much more than an offshoot of Egypt. If its pottery predates Egypt by 3,000 years. Anyhow, tell us about the first kingdom of Kush, which starts around 2,500 BC, and how does a civilization last for 3,000 years? None of the modern Western civilizations. The Romans were lucky to get up to 1,000 years, let alone 3.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in its earliest iteration at the city of what's today Karima, but it was Kerma. This is about 2,500, perhaps even 3,000 years ago, which means it predates ancient Greece and Rome. The kingdom at Kerma flourished. There are two edifices which are still standing today, one extremely high, I forget its exact dimensions, but you can see that it was, an edifice that was probably used either as a very substantial residence. There's a necropolis nearby. Sudanese archaeologists such as Dr. Shadia Taha, who informed a lot of the work I did on that chapter, believes that the enameling of pottery, which we associate so much with the ancient Greeks and the the ancient Egyptians, was something that could really have originated in the first iteration of the Kingdom of Kush at Kerma, even the dyeing of material. So, and we know very little about it. We know about the way their burial practices and so on, but the problem with trying to uncover ancient Sudan is that it is such a vast country. It was the biggest in Africa until 2011. After the South seceded, it fell to number 3. But it's a huge country. The searing heat of the Sahara Desert means it's very difficult to excavate there. So I am confident that in time, Sudanology will be as well known as Egyptology, and we'll find out more about the kingdom of ancient northern Sudan. And then I focus mostly on the heyday of the Kingdom of Kush, which is around the 7th, 8th century BCE, when the kings of Kush governed Egypt for the best part of a century. And it was basically a regional superpower at that time. And one of its kings is actually mentioned in the Bible. Such was his significance. So what I think is interesting about the story of Kush is that today, if you look at the Sudan, I mean, this awful conflict in which thousands of people have died, maybe 13, 14,000 people starving, blah, 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 all that terrible stuff going on. But it shows you how kingdoms rise and fall, the Gibbon story, the rise and fall of empires and so on. And I think that is one which is a very good illustration of that. 1,000 pyramids in ancient northern Sudan, about 300 preserve their superstructure that you can still see today. The treasures, a lot of them have been pillaged, obviously, over the years. As you know, so much of Africa's art, 90% of it is held outside the continent. So I think its story has been eclipsed by its more glittering neighbor, as it were, to the north, Egypt.
And let's talk about another civilization, that of Aksum, which has been described as one of the 4 great civilizations of the ancient world. And that also has fallen, as you say, into the footnotes of global history. That lasted 1,000 years in roughly where Ethiopia and Eritrea are today. And they had their own castles and monasteries and churches and so on. Tell us about them and also about their Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Kingdom of Aksum, as you rightly say, the Persian mystic Manu, from whom we get the term Manichaean when we talk about the Manichaean view of history, that's where it comes from. Said Aksum was one of the 4 greatest civilizations of the world. It lasted from the 1st to the 10th centuries, Common Era. And in the 300s, early 300s, one of its kings, King Ezana, made Christianity the official religion of his kingdom. And that means that the Kingdom of Aksum was one of the top 3 kingdoms in the world to adopt Christianity officially. So it was Armenia. Some people say it was Aksum second, others say it was Georgia, but anyway, it's in the top 3. And he converted from his pagan beliefs to Christianity, and the royal family and the court all became Christians, and then it gradually just spread to the hinterland. And until 1975, Christianity was the official religion of Ethiopia, which of course is where the Kingdom of Aksum was based, in what is now Ethiopia and also Eritrea. So that again is an example of somebody whose name is not known, and yet he was, a significant Christian player. He could read ancient Greek. He probably conversed in it. The Aksumites had their own script, their own, they started writing their language around the late 2nd century. So, and they, built monuments and castles and stela where they buried their royals. So again, it's a kingdom about which people don't know very much. And again, it was situated in a country which has become a bit of a byword for famine, Ethiopia, obviously, from the 1970s. So that's another character. And, I tried, Andrew, very much in the writing of my book to focus on characters, because it was Macaulay, the historian, who said history is best understood when it's seared into the imagination. And I interpreted that to mean through personalities, because I think it's through personalities that you can best sear history into the imagination. We all know about the Reformation in England because of Henry VIII wanting to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn and all the rest of it. So, it's I think, a very powerful tool for communicating history, which is why it is quite a character-led kind of book. I use the personalities to explain the key events that were taking place at that time in that region.
Oh, absolutely. No, that is very much the way to keep the reader's attention. You say it's not an academic book, but it is fully footnoted and is, to all intents and purposes, one. You also say it's not a contested history, as in you're not going out of your way to try and make some kind of propaganda point. Which brings me on to the next question about Islam and Christianity, because you're very optimistic, should one say, about the idea that there's nothing inevitable about the conflict between the two in Africa. Tell us more about that, because obviously they have roughly equal amounts of worshippers there, don't they?
Absolutely. I mean, the three monotheistic religions all originated in what we would now call the Middle East. And obviously Africa, particularly East Africa's proximity and North Africa to what we would now call the Middle East was there. So all these three major religions have very deep roots in Africa. And, until recently, all three religions had very flourishing communities there. Obviously, the Jewish communities in North Africa and also in Ethiopia did depart in the modern era. But Islam and Christianity have proved remarkably durable and are half of the people, more or less. 15% still practice their traditional beliefs. And I think this idea that they are in conflict is not one that's borne out by reality. You'll go to so many African countries south of the Sahara, and you'll see that there are mixed marriages galore. Somebody's mother might be Muslim, the father might be Christian, and vice versa. So within even a family, first cousins might have different religions. Sometimes even brothers and sisters, siblings, have different religions. So I do think that this idea of the inevitable clash is not one that's shown on the whole. You can't see it on the whole in the continent. And often what are termed wars of religion in Africa, even historically, tend to be wars or fighting over resources or control of land or power, and religion just becomes one factor of many. But at their heart, there isn't really a conflict based on religion. Of course, we have the phenomenon which we've had in the last few decades of extremism, Boko Haram and the militants we see in the Sahel, and periodically in other parts of the continent. But these are part of a global phenomenon. They're not peculiar to Africa. They often have links with movements outside of the continent, and they're not to be minimized in any way, and they must be dealt with. But I would say that on the whole, historically speaking, and even in the present day, the Muslim and Christian communities coexist peacefully in Africa.
You mentioned the sort of struggle for resources. You point out 20,000 years ago, North Africa was green and humid, and the Sahara wasn't a desert. And obviously, as we see climate change and so on, the prospect of what Africa is going to be like 20,000 years from now, struggles over water and so on are likely, aren't they? And obviously, it leads to mass immigration as well. Maybe this should be the question I asked right at the end, but I'm going to ask it now. What do you see as the future of Africa, especially with regard to these struggles over resources?
I mean, the struggle over the resources are real. The water one that you mentioned, obviously, we see that manifested with the building of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, whereby they want to, harness the power of the Blue Nile. Its origins, its source is at Lake Tana in Ethiopia, and it flows through Ethiopia and goes into Sudan. It meets the White Nile at Khartoum, and they flow together as a single Nile into Egypt. And it's the waters of the Blue Nile that are very fertile, on which Egypt absolutely depends for its agriculture, always has done and always will. And historically, Ethiopia has had very little benefit from having the Blue Nile. And you can see that, there have been fairly bellicose statements on both sides. They're trying to find a way of, peacefully resolving the conflict. But that's just one example of how, the struggle over water has been bubbling. It is apparent in Africa. In terms of the impact of climate change, we know that Africa is the continent which is disproportionately affected by global warming, even though it has contributed least of all. The continent as a whole contributes about 3% to global carbon emissions. The United States, by comparison, for instance, is about just one single country, 25, 26, 27%. So when you see a whole continent is only 3%, and if you strip out the industrial north from that figure, south of the Sahara, Africa accounts for 0.5 percentage point of global carbon emissions. So you can see that when we debate in the West about mitigation is important, the question many people in Africa ask is, how do you mitigate that 0.5 percentage point of global carbon emissions? So in Africa, the debate shows how it's different from the one in the West. It's very much about adaptation. You can't will the sky to rain. You can't make the, drought-stricken land fertile again. So it's all about adaptation. The Africans are immensely good at adaptation. That's what they've done all their lives. Their resilience is remarkable. And that is why when I look at Africa and think about its future, if I think about it in the short term, then it's a fairly pessimistic picture. We can see what's going on across the continent at the moment, the lack of good governance, the conflicts, the coups, the food insecurity, and all the rest of it. I'm not starry-eyed about the continent, but I believe if you take the long-term view of Africa, and by that I mean possibly even 20 to 25 years, then I think you really have cause to be optimistic about the continent. And I say that for two reasons, really. The first reason being, in terms of resources, Africa has got a huge amount of the minerals that we need for our technological revolution, the green revolution, the lithium, cobalt, which you need for batteries for green cars, bauxite, all sorts of things. For instance, mining in the Democratic Republic of the Congo of cobalt accounts for 70% of global mining in the world of cobalt. So Africa has a very strong ace to play if its natural resources are properly exploited for the benefit of its people. You need good government for that, but you also need responsible partners who will help you do it in the West. So you need both sides of the equation for that. And if that's done, then Africa really could, be a kind of superpower in the future for our green revolution. The second reason I'm super optimistic is a lot of people see Africa's demography as a curse. I think it's actually a boon. I mean, it's a very young continent. The average age is 18 or 19. If you think at the rest of the world, Japan, 49, Italy, 47, the United Kingdom is 41, France, 42, the US and China, 38. These are aging populations. Africa is young. By 2040, 25% of the world's consumers, producers, workers will be African. Young people want to achieve, they're productive, they're strong, they're healthy, they're digitally savvy, increasingly becoming well-educated. And so just as we all, yearn for our youth and think, oh, those were the days when I could just, jump over this and that and had stacks of energy. It's a continent with stacks of energy, and surely, therefore, it will be productive and achieve.
I think if we could talk about this, you mentioned Southern Sahara. historically, historians think that it was cut off from the global economy for centuries, but you argue that it wasn't at all, and that kings like Mansa Musa the 14th century king of the Mali Empire, who was the richest man in the world, $400 billion in today's money. This you argue strongly that actually that it wasn't in any way cut off from the global economy. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was part of the idea that, there are those people who think that there are those who make history and those who remain on the sidelines of history, with Africa very much being Africans being put on the sidelines of history. So the story of Mansa Musa, who was born in 1280 and he died in 1332, is a good illustration of how Africans south of the Sahara were actually integrated into world affairs. And I say this because if you look at the pilgrimage that he embarked on in 1324 to 1325, when he went with a household of 12,000 people, 500 personal servants, 60,000 porters, 100 elephants, each bearing 100 camels, not elephants, camels, bearing between 10 to 20 tons of gold. A fantastic amount of gold that he took, up to 20 tons. And on his way back from the pilgrimage in Mecca, he stopped off at Cairo and he spent so much money and gave away so much gold that the price of gold plunged by 25% and did not regain its previous value for more than a decade. And that's the global price of gold. And, this at a time when England was being plagued by the Black Death, like other parts of Europe and so on. This man, clad in silk and wearing a golden crown and carrying a golden orb in his hand, and all his servants, also clad in silk and all the rest of it. And the fact that he basically controlled the price of gold through his wealth shows you how Africa was part of the global economy. And in 1375, a Catalan cartographer drew a map of the world, and there was Mansa Musa as one of the 4 or 5 regions that was depicted on that map. So important was he.
Let's talk about the slave trade. What you do very sensibly, in my view, is in your 2 chapters on the slave trade, you break them down with one concerning the Indian Ocean and that slave trade, and another the Atlantic Ocean. And you don't you acknowledge that the whole role of Africans in buying and selling fellow Africans in the Arab and the later European slave trade is a very difficult subject, but you do tackle it head on. And you point out that there are 14 million Africans who were sold by Arabs and their allies from the 7th to the 19th century. Although overall, of course, especially in the West, we concentrate on the Atlantic slave trade and the undoubted monstrous horrors that took place there. Do you think that when you say it's a difficult subject, do you think that we are approaching the subject in the right way in the West? Or is it now so toxic a subject, essentially, that it's beyond being discussed in an objective manner?
Yeah, I mean, I do say that I hope there aren't tin ears on all sides, and that the debate has started. We're not going to be able to put it back at all. And therefore, we should have a reasonable and reasoned debate about the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, what we think of the issue of reparations, restitution, and statues. These are kind of all 3 pillars of the current debate we have. Also, the teaching of history is the other aspect of it, focusing, as a lot of people have, on colonial history and how that should be taught. And I mean, my view is that we should have a debate and that people should listen to other opinions with respect and advance their own point of view. But first of all, if I look at the restitution debate, that really has almost been settled. There are discussions about the modalities, the process, how you actually do it. Is it a loan? Is it a short-term loan, a long-term loan? Is it an open-ended loan and all the rest of it? But that debate, in a sense, about restitution has happened.
So long as, can I just butt in? So long as they actually do go on show in the Benin Bronzes is the classic example of this in Nigeria, where they seem to have wound up in the king's palace and aren't being shown to the public, let alone anything like the numbers would see them in the British Museum.
Yeah, I mean, this is the German government who returned some artifacts from the Benin Kingdom to Benin, and the Oba, or the King of Benin, has put them on show in either in his own palace or in a museum which he is building. There are 3 museums which are being built in Benin at the moment. But I think that the debate that everybody will see them in the British Museum is one that has to be examined, because a lot of the things that the British Museum keeps are actually not on display. I forget what the figure is, but it's
usually 1 in 14, I think, is the
in storage. And I think that, I spoke to the King of Benin, the Oba of Benin, about this. And he said, look, and this is a man who was Benin, of course, I'm talking about southern Nigeria, not the Republic of Benin, the country. And he was a former Nigerian ambassador to Italy. So he's very aware of the power of culture. And he said, look, I'd like a lot of them returned, but I want a lot to stay in museums such as the British Museum to kind of act as ambassadors for our culture, because we feel that we are part of global history, global story. So we want them there. And this is what he said to me, personally, I have it on record. So I think that there are those perhaps who want to see fought with the principle and will clutch at stories like this and say, oh, they're not being displayed. And actually, he is, as I say, building a museum. There's another one being built with the help of the British Museum. But I think, Andrew, when the French government carried out a study in 2018 and found that 90%, in fact, at least 90% of Africa's artifacts and treasures are kept outside of the continent, I think that's far too much, far too much. And these are countries that want to build up their tourism. I have visited dozens and dozens of museums right across Africa. I went to more than 30 African countries for the research for the TV series and the book. And they are pathetic, the exhibitions they have. Where they're good, they have replicas. And, especially for Africans who record their history through their art, carvings on furniture which may depict a battle or whatever. This is more than art. This is their culture, their tradition, the soul of their people or their nation. And to have it, for the most part, outside of the continent, I think is not right. And that debate, as I say, has really been, it's finished, really. Very few people would argue, for just hanging on to everything and not sending it. It's just a question of how can we be sure that they'll be kept, in the right conditions and that they're secure and so on and so forth. And it's correct that these checks must be made. So everything should be taken on a case-by-case basis, but it's not the same as the Italians saying, oh, why have the French got the Mona Lisa? It was made by one of us. The Italians have got so much else. They're, bursting at the seams with art in their own country, but the Africans have barely nothing. And just very quickly on reparations, again, I think that that's happening piecemeal. You've got, like my acquaintance, Laura Trevelyan from the Trevelyan family, who made a lot of money from the slave trade in the Caribbean. They're trying to have some form of reparations themselves. Some companies have done that and so on, the Church of England or whatever. So that is also already happening. Should we have a debate that we have a more coherent way of doing it, or what is the best way? I think that's a good idea. And in terms of statues, I think also...
The money isn't going to Africans in Africa, though, is it? It's going to Africans in British Africans in Britain.
I think it's the descendants of the enslaved people. So the Caribbean, in America, the descendants of enslaved people, and also, wherever they are in the diaspora, there are those who argue that Africa as a continent itself should receive some form of reparations. Nana Akufo-Addo, the president of Ghana, is one of those who argues for that, because he says if you take 12.5 million, mostly men, across the Atlantic, you're taking the strongest and the best and you are depriving the continent of productivity, and it's had a detrimental effect on development. So people like him argue for, some reparations for Africa. But I think the Caribbean countries have got a very clear 10-point plan through CARICOM, the Association of Caribbean Nations, which says we are middle-income countries. We qualify for no aid whatsoever from the United Kingdom, no development aid. We might get a bit of humanitarian here and there, but as middle-income countries, we get nothing. And our health and education systems are, in need of some assistance. And this could be a neat way of us receiving some development aid by having it come to us in the form of reparations, specifically to address education and health needs. So, there are different ways. I think this idea that some Americans have that, every Black American should, turn up on Monday morning with a bag of money, courtesy of reparations, regardless of whether you're, multi-billionaire Oprah Winfrey, is a bit of a non-starter and has given the whole debate a bit of a bad name. And then just very quickly on statues, I think, again, we've already seen things like, the Colston statue being relegated from a very prominent position and put in a museum. We've seen that happen right across Africa. King Leopold, his statue, which overlooked the main square, has been put in the museum. So it's not about destroying, countries renamed. Zimbabwe was Rhodesia, Rhodes, Jan Smuts International Airport becomes Oliver Tambo Airport. I mean, these are all, I think, the right things to do, and people have the right to do that. But I don't like contested history, and I didn't set out to write a book that, puts the boot into colonialism. There are many books that have been written about colonialism, and I really wanted to just write a book about the occluded history of Africa, the pre-colonial history. 18 chapters. I don't get to the transatlantic slave trade till chapter 14. So that was my purpose.
Did you find it difficult to cover the role of women, considering how few sources really look at women as opposed to women in other situations, usually vis-a-vis men?
That's a problem for every country or region's history, isn't it? I think people take that HIS in history a bit too seriously, his story. And, because history is often a history of conquests, and it's men who go into battle and lead armies. And so inevitably, the focus has been all over the world more on the male figures, and African history extols the virtues and the courage and the vision of, their strong leaders and so on. So women do get slightly overshadowed. And I tried where I could to focus on strong female personalities, or to explain how even if a woman couldn't rule in her own right, who your mother was as a king or a chief was very important. I also included, facts where I could about powerful queen mothers like Queen Idia of Benin, whose fame has eclipsed that of the son she protected for so long because of that beautiful Benin bronze in the British Museum. So where I could, I tried to feminize the history, as it were. And it's not difficult because, of course, women were part of history, and, mass disobedience campaigns at the time of independence in Africa, there were many women. And even in 2019, when the people of Sudan rose against Omar al-Bashir in the uprising, women were very much in the vanguard, and they styled themselves as Kandakas, which is the ancient name for the queen or queen mother from the kingdoms of Kush.
Now, there's a question that I ask all my guests, two questions, in fact. The first one is, what history book or biography are you reading at the moment?
Well, I love historians. I admire you, Andrew, but I have to say I adore Professor Sir David Cannadine.
Oh, we all admire David. He's wonderful, wonderful historian, of course.
He is. No, so I said, I thought, oh, shall I name one of Andrew's? But
No, don't do. They all do that, frankly. Which book of David's are you reading at the moment?
I had read it a while ago, but I'm now reading The Undivided Past by David Cannadine, which is a wonderful book because it is exactly what I believe in, history beyond our differences. And this Manichaean view of the world is one that he refutes. And, David writes as beautifully as he speaks, and he just shows that it's fun to read, but he just shows how, throughout history, humanity has defined itself by the mutually exclusive and adversarial identities of nationhood, race, or civilizations, religion, as we've been talking about. But David just shows that this is misleading and often wrong. So I just love reading this book because it underscores a belief I have, which is, let's remember our common humanity. Like I said, let's remember that we all came out of Africa.
Well, we all came out of Lucy. Tell me about your what if. What's your counterfactual?
Oh dear, now this is a difficult one. I will have to go back to the kingdom of Kush, and I would go to look at the story of one of the kings of Kush, and that will be Shabako, who very nearly drove the Assyrians out of the Middle East. The Assyrians, of course, very powerful, warlike army, and he engaged, as his predecessors did, in armies, in fierce battles. Assurbanipal, he fought with, and then, Assurbanipal was the Assyrian king who finally defeated him in the 600s. But I think that what if he hadn't, then I think the Kushites would have gone on to perhaps be, the regional superpower of Western Asia, and history might have been quite different, and the kingdom of Kush might have lasted for another 1,000 years. Who knows?
Actually, the way you tell these stories really is marvelous. There's another king who I wanted to mention, Lalibela, of the Zagwe, 1162 to 1221. We knew he was going to be a great man because when he was born, there was a swarm of bees. There's an extraordinary sort of cross between Oedipus and lots of Shakespeare going on in his life. There's a point where he drinks poisoned beer, despite knowing it was poisoned. His brother Harbe tried to flog him, but he was unmarked by the flogging. It's a tremendous story, and then out of guilt gives up his throne to his brother, who then goes on to build 11 fabulous churches, many of which are still in existence today.
All in existence.
All of them are still in existence today.
Churches, really, really an amazing wonder.
Yeah. So it's stories like this that make this book an African history of Africa a real must-read for my listeners. Thank you very much indeed, Zeinab. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Andrew. Really enjoyed it. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Zeinab. On my next Secrets of Statecraft, my guest will be Dan Hannan. Lord Hannan is a British writer, journalist and politician, and advisor to the Board of Trade, and he was a member of the European Parliament from 1999 to 2020.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.